Together is a horror comedy where we follow Millie and Tim, played by celebrity couple Allison Brie and Dave Franco. They're a long-term couple and they decide to move out to a small town to pursue a better career opportunity for Millie. The two of them struggle with a lack of intimacy in their relationship and feeling like they are forced together out in the countryside, which takes on a whole new meaning when a supernatural encounter causes their bodies to literally fuse. So the core subject of this movie should be pretty obvious. It's a story about codependency. It's about the places in life lovers find themselves in where they've become so intertwined, whether that be emotionally or financially, that they more or less feel trapped together. In a manner of speaking, they complete each other. They each have areas where they feel incomplete and gain something from the other, but that's not always a comforting truth. Sometimes it's a bitter one. This movie begs the question that a lot of long-term couples tend to ask at some point: do we still love each other, or are we just complacent? Wanting to stay in your long-term relationship even when you're not that into them anymore is quite common because they at least fill the void of loneliness. The fear of being alone and the fear of one's long-term investment feeling like it was all for nothing are what often lead people to justify staying in their relationships even when they're not very fruitful anymore. That seems to be the case with these two, and of course, when the greater aspects of a relationship start to fade away, what you are left with to dwell on are the negatives. Leading to the secondary subject of the movie, sacrifice. The movie highlights the ways lovers can become burdens in each other's lives, how every decision one of them makes ripples into the others, and the things they've had to forego in life for the sake of their relationship. Of course, every relationship takes effort and commitment. What the film really digs into is the emotional toll of that effort, how hard it can be to tell the difference between resilience and denial, and how staying together sometimes feels less like a choice and more like an obligation. It then relies on our emotional discipline to figure out if what's left is worth salvaging. While many symptoms of codependency and elements of sacrifice are quite literally present in their relationship, they are also depicted symbolically through the movie's horror. We see one of them out living their life, and as a result of this strange supernatural phenomenon, it quite literally affects the other person and their physicality. They start to magnetize toward each other, reflecting how on some level they feel obligated to stay close, not out of desire, but out of force. In this story about a couple at a stage where they're feeling reluctantly inseparable, this strange force causes their bodies to literally start merging. This fusion illustrates how they've reached a point in their relationship where separating now feels impossible without feeling like they're sawing off a part of themselves. This body fusion is what makes it into a body horror film. It has some pretty disturbing looking imagery when their bodies are basically trying to eat each other's. At its lightest, it just looks like they're sharing skin, but at its heaviest, things get pretty grotesque. Really, there was only like one scene where the body horror was genuinely gross. Otherwise, the bulk of it was pretty tame, assuming that you don't mind a bit of blood and gore. For you seasoned horror fans who don't, you might actually find it pretty mild. The part of the movie that seems like it would be the most graphic and hard to watch was actually cut short by a smash cut, so overall, it wasn't too hard to stomach. There are some jump scares, but honestly, they're probably only gonna get viewers who are less engaged. Like the second or two leading up to them, you can kind of see them coming. It was a fully packed theater, but not many people were gasping at the jump scares. It was an advanced screening though, so I would like to assume that most of those viewers were true horror fans. So perhaps it is just because the diehards have developed a sixth sense for the jump scares. But yeah, pretty much every time I was like, okay, yeah, there's gonna be a jump scare in 3, 2. But it is a horror comedy, and the humor is pretty tasteful. The jokes are often subtle. Other times they're punchy, but the jokes work. Even if they're not that funny, they're thankfully at least not cringy. Sometimes with horror comedies, the director can fall into the trap of full sending the comedy to the point where the movie is just utterly absurd. But this one thankfully wasn't too over the top. You can sense a bit of self-awareness in how these situations are framed. The director realizes that this phenomenon and these situations are kind of silly, so he doesn't try to frame them as excessively grim. But he also doesn't force the humor through obvious setups or exaggerated performances. He lets the audience decide what's funny as opposed to trying to shove humor in their face like, yeah, that's right, it's a comedy. It allows us the freedom to laugh at these situations as much as we would like, as opposed to having awkward moments where we have to instinctively determine if the joke is actually as funny as it intended to be, or if it was just flat. Outside of the horror scenes, much of the subtle humor paints an accurate portrait of what relationships can be like. It's very quirky, with our two characters being very unembarrassed about things that your average single guy would probably recoil at the idea of experiencing. This will likely resonate with long-term couples. And outside of the humor, the movie does a good job of capturing the monotony that a long-term relationship often consists of. It can be really exhausting watching romance films that try to paint relationships as very flowery and drenched with passion, whether that be in their love or their conflicts. Sure, this is a horror film, but it's worth mentioning that the movie does not over-dramatize their conflicts. It shows a relationship that feels at risk in ways that feel very authentic, the petty arguments and the quiet resentments that build over time. The tension in their relationship was handled very well, so much so that leading up to the climax of the film, I could have seen it going either of two directions. It wasn't too predictable, and either outcome would have been feasible, but the one that we did get worked pretty well. The very end was a little bit unexpected, but it did work. It leaned into the movie's more playful tone. As for criticisms, the first thing that comes to mind is that it takes a while for things to really feel like they're coming together. It takes about an hour to really rope you in. All of the setup leading up to that point did feel like it was necessary. All of the seeds needed planting, and their dynamic needed to be established, but the movie's best qualities were the horror and the comedy. Shocker, right? In the first hour, we get a few good laughs and just little tastes of the body horror that would eventually come. For a movie that's only an hour and 45 minutes, it feels like more time could have been spent in the deep end of the movie's madness. And while the film effectively explores emotional distance and neglect in relationships, it doesn't really spend any time on how couples might actively and feasibly rekindle their connection. On one hand, sure, that's kind of the point of the movie. These two are drifting apart, and the big question they are asking themselves is, should we salvage this relationship? But considering how the movie hinges on symbolism and how interpreting that symbolism is what makes it really compelling, how relationships might be rebuilt feels like a crucial component that is just missing regardless of how the story ends. Sure, acknowledging our flaws and how we might be neglecting our partner is also crucial, and the movie highlights neglect and disconnection well, but that's not always the problem. The movie also has some horror cliches that make it feel a bit small. You know, small wooded town and very few supporting characters who feel more like plot devices than they do characters. And the big reveal in the third act was delivered pretty cheaply, like the timing of our character's big plot discovery doesn't actually make any sense. When you think about it, there's no canonical reason this couldn't have been revealed to her earlier. For storytelling reasons, it obviously makes more sense to be in the third act, but everything revolving how it's revealed feels pretty contrived. The movie does feel concise with its runtime. It doesn't feel like it overstays its welcome at all, but it does just feel a bit simple. It feels like there could have been a little bit more to sink your teeth into. But overall, the movie works for what it is. It has its entertaining moments, some good laughs, and enough intrigue to hold your interest for its entirety. It was a movie that I walked out of thinking, yeah, it was decent. I want to echo that I think this is actually a good date night movie for couples who are big fans of horror film fans, but even for you singles out there who like horror, you might get a kick out of it. But I did have this thought: if you and your partner are in a rough patch and you think this movie will be a fun thing to bond over, perhaps don't see this movie, because I don't think it has the answers that you are seeking. Thanks for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please give it a like. It really does help this channel grow. I'll see you later this week with my review of Fantastic Four.